price was the average of the high and the low for the month. It's not very good data, and you get very high serial correlation of stock returns. And it turns out if you try to do the same analysis with the Coles data, you get no effects for anything. So what a bunch of guys at Yale did, Getzman, Ibbotson, and Pung, what they did was they got together and they essentially extended the CRISP data back to 1815. Now, it's not perfect because the CRISP data doesn't include, well, it includes like New York Stock Exchange stocks, but it doesn't include the regionals necessarily. So, like for example, I think a lot of mining stocks were in Boston, for example, during the 19th century. So essentially, the New York data is a bunch of railroads. If you go back far enough, that's really what's there. So it's not perfect, but it's way better than what we had before. You can construct an index of these things. And you can see whether stock return volatility during the fall harvest season is higher during the free banking period and during the national banking period in the fall harvest season. And you can also look now back to the Second Bank of the United States, and you can also look forward to the Aldrich Vreeland Fed period, and you'll see that essentially, so this agricultural identification helps, because what we're looking at is essentially a difference in differences rather than, there could be secular trends in volatility for other reasons we have no idea about, which is why we identify things this way. So we look at this volatility and we say, well, it turns out that the volatility is higher in the fall, but only when there's no lender of last resort. So that's basically, so it looks like the Federal Reserve and the Second Bank of the United States both lowered liquidity risk. Now, it would have been nice to go back to the period of the First Bank of the United States if we could have done so, since we had a central bank then as well. Unfortunately, you can't do that because there was a big fire in Washington. During the War of 1812, for which we blame the British, they came over and for no reason at all, they burned Washington, D.C. And that was it. All the records for the First Bank of the United States are gone, which is probably good because I know at least one of my co-authors, Mark, would certainly have wanted to go back and collect that data as well. Okay, so we can't go back there. Now, so what we do also is we say, look, one of the other predictions of this Brunemeyer and Peterson model is that, stock prices should decline when interest rates go up. It's not enough to just look at volatility. That's suggestive, but you want to know whether the stock prices actually go down. So this occurs in Brunemeyer and Peterson's paper because the spreads widen. And of course, it's also going to occur, it can occur for a couple of reasons. Another reason it would occur is that the speculators were actually net long in markets, and they were buying on margin, and they had to unwind their positions. Well, there's going to be net selling, and that's going to drive down asset prices also. And then, of course, there's the balance sheet channel, and you don't really know. If things are bad enough for long enough, what's going to happen is that, the inability for companies to fund continued operations is also going to drive down asset prices. So you can see there's lots of reasons why these interest rate shocks might have an effect on asset returns. And so we want to look at that. And we can't go back past 1868 right now, although we're working on it for commercial paper. So we look to see whether changes in call loan rates, for example, are going to Granger cause changes in asset returns. And in fact, so that's our big test. And in fact, I wouldn't be telling you this if it didn't work, right? That's sort of the way these academic talks always work. You can't present the null result really well. Well, you can present it, but then it doesn't. It gets rejected from every journal.
Not if you're the editor.
Hmm?
Not if you're the editor.
Oh yes,
it's really could publish us.
Okay, so what we do is we find that increases in the call loan rate do Granger cause stock returns at the 1% level of significance. So that's just lovely. Now, it's not really a very big effect. Now, there's reasons Brunemeyer and Peterson say that. They say, look, well, if there's a small, I don't know, I haven't checked, and we need to check this. I don't know what a 1 standard deviation change in call loan rates isn't that big. A financial crisis is going to be way more than that. So then you say, well, that's one thing. And another thing is, in their model at least, and that model is only suggestive if you see the bells and whistles in it, in their model at least, What's going to be the case is that the effect's nonlinear. So small changes do basically nothing, but big changes can cause a crisis, and then you see this relationship. That's their claim. And in fact, we need to check to see if we find evidence for that nonlinear relationship, and of course we haven't done that yet. All we've done so far is this Granger causality test, where we, I don't know what you would do. Like, it would be like the equivalent of like a spline regression or something like that with Granger causality, which I'm sure you could do. I just haven't thought about it, but I'm going to think about it now. All right. Now we say, look, well, when does this happen? It turns out that it's only when the Fed is not in operation. Of course, we can't check for the second bank because we don't have interest rate data that goes back far enough, although maybe we can get something. It turns out that this only happens in the pre-Federal Reserve period, and it doesn't happen the rest of the time, which suggests that you don't really, basically I think it's evidence for this nonlinearity. Of course there are changes, but the changes aren't very big in the call-over rate because it doesn't spike, and the reason it doesn't spike is because they have a lender of last resort in the first place. And so there's not really going to be as much of a problem there. Okay. So what I had planned for the talk, of course now it's already 12:30, is I'll briefly run through an anatomy of financial crisis before World War I. For those of you who don't know how things used to work. See, we think the Brunemeyer and Peterson model is a great model for the 19th century. It could be a fine model for the 20th century too, or even the 21st century. I just don't know really how to test it as well now. We'll talk about the predictions for the Brunemeyer and Peterson model in our environment, as well as these other sort of ancillary predictions from other models, like what Bernanke and Gertler would talk about. And then we'll talk about the empirical relation between interest rates and stock returns. So you'll get to see how big the effects are. And then I'll conclude a little bit with the next steps, which are, we haven't done anything directly testing the relation between funding liquidity and market liquidity. And the reason we haven't done anything, we're just not there yet. We haven't looked at the relation on bid-ask spreads. We have the data now. And we're collecting daily data to see, if you look at the micro level, during a crisis period, whether the effect is magnified. That's why we're collecting daily data, because monthly data during a crisis period of 3 months, that's not really worth a whole lot. 3 observations, or so. Okay. So what did things look like in the bad old days? Well, in the worse old days, before 1863, where I don't know very much about things, the United States had hundreds of different currencies circulating at different exchange rates. It was kind of like Europe. Whenever people talk about European monetary union, they talk about, well, this is a very hard problem. We basically faced this problem in the US in 1789, around the time of the founding of the Republic. Basically, we had all these different currencies, and it took a long time before we had a united currency. And you guys probably have never heard, well, not all of you, some of us are old enough to remember, when there were domestic exchange rates. I think there were until like the 1930s, in fact. Well, maybe none of us are quite old enough for that, to remember that. But there were many different currencies, and now, of course, we don't have that. We have foreign exchange rates. So that's what we used to have. Now, what the National Banking Act of 1863 was designed to do was have a uniform currency, raise revenue for the Civil War, which is not really important for this paper, and we had federally chartered banks. So what did the banks do? The banks, how they lent was they deposited reserves with the Treasury by purchasing government bonds. The government then allowed banks to issue up to some amount, a minimum of 90% of the par or the market value, one of those, the minimum of those two, of banknotes that could be lent out. But that was it. You were done. That was the most you could lend. And of course, that was fine, but then there were a bunch of really dumb things of course now we have really dumb things too that go on, like AIG gets to do all the credit default swap insuring for the entire world. That wasn't too smart either. Maybe that was even worse than this. We had a three-tiered reserve system. There was New York City banks, which were the top tier then as now. The second tier was the reserve city banks, and then there were the country banks. Now, why would we care about this three-tiered reserve system? Well, the top 2 tiers had to keep 25% of deposits as reserves. So that sounds like a lot, right? Unfortunately, it was not as much as you think. The third tier had to keep 15%, but of this, 60% could be deposited in the top or second tier banks. Now, the requirements today seem worse, 10% on transaction deposits and 0% on time deposits. Maybe they're worse, but I'm not so sure about that. The problem was, the way things worked was, what